morning. I'm back. So I'm doing Mandy has invited me to do a series on ableism in the church. And so this week I was set to talk about the LGBTQIA experience and how that intersects with disability. Having that June was Pride, and then July is actually Disability Pride. And I know that some people didn't know that Disability Pride exists, but it does, and it's growing. But I kind of wanted to focus on something different this week, straying a little bit away from this concept, mainly because of in light of recent natural disasters or natural things that have happened. And what I mean by that is the recent earthquakes that we've felt, and how people with disabilities tend to be excluded a little bit from evacuation plans, and how they tend to not be accessible. And I just wanted to bring light into that, because it brings me back to think about how a lot of the times the world that we live in is very inaccessible for people with disabilities. And so it has me kind of conflicted between, if we think about Genesis, when God created the world and he created humankind, he created everyone to his image and to his likeness. And so when he did that, we saw last week when I talked about Moses, and when I talked about how God was, he valued Moses with his disability and the gifts that he had to offer. However, when we live in the real world, it's kind of different, because we see that the world physically is not really built to include people with disabilities in it. And so with that, we have what's called the social model of disability, which means that we are more disabled by society rather than by our own impairments. Interesting concept, because our bodies do tend to impair us in certain ways. However, the fact that society is so inaccessible at times, it does disable us from being able to fully participate in society. And so that's why, to me, it was a little it's just this internal conflict that exists. It's like God created the world for everybody. However, the reality is that sometimes the world is not, it shows people with disabilities that we're not really welcome in that. And so how does that tie into the church? How many of you have heard of the ADA, the law, the ADA? So a few heads are nodding. And the ADA essentially was passed in the 1990s. It's a civil rights law. And if you kind of pay attention to that, 90s, the civil rights movement happened in the 60s. But it took 30 years after that for disability to be even mentioned in the civil rights movement. And so, that kind of says something. But one thing that I have recently learned is that actually churches are exempt from following the ADA law. So they don't have to abide by that law because they are religious. So that means anything that is religiously affiliated, whether it's schools or any other public domain, if it has a religious denomination, or if it's used for religious purposes, whether it's public or not, they're not required to abide by the ADA. And so with that, it goes back to what I said last week about a lot of the buildings being inaccessible, and thinking about how churches can get away with it. Well, they're not really, they don't have to abide by the ADA. And so I think that's very interesting to see that even in today's society. But, again, when we talk about First Church, I like that even though, churches tend to be exempt from that, we still remain a more accessible church for people. And it's not just because of the law, but because we want to be inclusive of everyone. And, I think it's a very bold move to take if we were to say, First Church does support the ADA, and we want to follow it, and we want to make sure that people with disabilities are included in the congregation. And so that's what I kind of was thinking all about when we were going through the earthquakes, just because I was out in a public place. I was in a theater watching a play, and then it started shaking, and that was the first time I had been away from my family by myself during major earthquake like that. And it was scary because once people started evacuating, I can't really be around crowds because I lose my balance very fast. And so I had to kind of wait for everybody to leave. And that's the protocol. Like if you're disabled, you're supposed to kind of wait to see if when somebody comes to do the rounds of like checking if people remain on site, that's when people are supposed to help you. But by that point, you know, God knows what would happen at that point. And so it just caused a lot of anxiety for me when I was experiencing that. And I wanted to kind of talk about accessibility overall and what we can do to be more purposeful about that. And yeah, that's all I have for you today. Thank you.